Okay, we are live from New Jersey. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Richard and I are humbled by the fact that we have people from all over the United States and Canada, and we want to send out a special welcome to our friends in Vietnam and Qatar. So thanks for being here. We're very happy to be doing this. Just some brief introductions as to who we are. My name is Peter Hagen, and I'm the Associate Dean of General Studies here at the Richard Stockton University in southern New Jersey. And it's about 10, 12 miles due west of Atlantic City in New Jersey. Our area is probably going to be underwater in 100 to 200 years, so you folks in Pennsylvania can say, well, that's where New Jersey used to be. At any rate, I'm also the director of the Center for Academic Advising, and all of my degrees are in the humanities, and I'm joined here today by
Rich. Here.
Come on in.
I'm here.
There he is.
What? Go ahead.
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Rich Trauma. I'm Assistant Director of Academic Advising here at Stockton, and like Peter, have a love of literature and the concept of narrative. So thanks for being here.
So between us, we have 5 degrees, all in the humanities, mostly in literature, and a 6th one is on the way, as I understand it. Okay, so here we go. Here in the United States, there's a small but growing number of scholars and practitioners of advising who are turning to the humanities, like we do, to inform how we think about academic advising. Articles and presentations on hermeneutics or narrative are becoming more and more common at conferences all around the world, in fact. We are among those who hold that approaches to academic advising that originate in the traditional fields of the humanities, history, literature, philosophy, and so on, can fruitfully inform the theory and the practice of academic advising. Specifically, today we are arguing that narrative, storytelling, has much to offer our collective work towards understanding academic advising and practicing it well. This is part of a multi-year project that we've been engaged in, and so thank you for being here today. Well, to start things off, we have to, it behooves us to establish some major claims. So the first one, which is fairly strong, fairly difficult to swallow, is that we can view human life as a narrative. Now, I'm going to get back to the quotation that's on the screen right now. But I just want to say that there are a number of researchers in recent years who have talked about viewing human life as a narrative, as a story. We all know that human lives are not, literally speaking, stories, but they might as well be, because the only way we can talk about them and think about them is as stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. Now, these works are cited in the bibliography in the handout that you all have. Clifford Geertz from the field of anthropology, The Interpretation of Culture. I think that goes back to the early 70s. Kenneth Gergen, The Saturated Self. A delightful little 2004 essay called Life as Narrative by Jerome Bruner from the field of social psychology. Very much worth your pursuing. Madan Sarab, Identity, Culture, and the Postmodern World from 1996 from the field of cultural studies. And an absolutely delightful statement. Now, this next is not from a theoretical work. It's from a collection of short biographies. It's by Phyllis Rose from 1983, and her book is called Parallel Lives, 5 Victorian Marriages. And it's the most elegant statement that I've come across about regarding human life as a narrative. She says, I believe, first of all, that living is an act of creativity, and that at certain moments of our lives, our creative imaginations are more conspicuously demanded than at others. At certain moments, the need to decide upon the story of our own lives becomes particularly pressing, when we choose a mate, for example, or embark upon a career. Living forces us to look for and forces us to find a design within the primal stew of data, which is our daily experience. There's a kind of arranging and telling and choosing of detail, of narration in short, which we must do so that one day will prepare us for the next day, one week prepare us for the next week.
Hey,
I love that statement.
Peter, can I butt in?
Absolutely.
At this point? To piggyback off of this, something that's even more up to present. Paul Kalinati's autobiography was just published in the United States. One of the telltale phrases in the autobiography, and this is a neurosurgeon who found out he had lung cancer and not very long to die, stage 4 lung cancer. One of the quotes in the book was his saying to his wife, "I need books at this time," in order to illustrate. I like this quote because in order to focus on what you just said, what we must do that one day will prepare us for the next day, 1 week prepare us for the next week, especially for someone who has been told something so terminal as lung cancer. But the salient part is getting to the point that this narrative concept is so very much a part of human experience.
All the way from the beginning to the end. Yes, indeed. Well, let's focus on this quotation that's on the screen right now. This is from a 2012 book by Jonathan Gottschall called The Storytelling Animal. And what he's alluding to is the name of our species. You know, we are Homo sapiens, which stands for what? The wise human, the wise man, or whatever it is. I'm not so sure that we can lay claim to that second part, sapiens, but we sure can lay claim to the second part, storytelling. And Gottschall, in that work, proposes that we rename the species and call ourselves Homo narrans, the storytelling animal. And it kind of makes sense. He says, we spend our lives crafting stories that make us the noble, if flawed, protagonists of first-person dramas. A life story is a personal myth about who we are deep down, where we come from, how we got this way, and what it all means. Our life stories are who we are. They are our identity. And then he shifts gears a little bit and says, well, a life story is not, however, an objective account. A life story, and we all do this, we do a little editing. A life story is a carefully shaped narrative that is replete with strategic forgetting and skillfully spun meanings. Where would we be if we couldn't forget some of those things that we need to forget in our lives? So on to major claim number 2. Students are humans. I know, yeah. You're thinking right now, oh my God, what do they do over there in New Jersey? Well, this, of course, is a radical claim. But if we can view human life as a narrative and view students as human, then we can begin to see advising those special human beings, our students, as having something to do with narratives. So, I mean, just focus on the young woman in the graphic right there, in the photograph. She's looking at you and saying, this is my life, this is my story. I need you to help me craft this story. I just love her smile. It's not a knowing smile. She's saying, I could use some help here. And that's where we come in. We help students co-author an important chapter of that narrative. So a third major claim is that perhaps it's not going too far to say that good advising depends upon narrative. If we think about it, narrative is one of the main tools that we have in order to listen to students and to impart advice. Students' lives might not literally be stories, but putting their lives into a story is the only way they have to convey to us advisors what their lived life is like. That's a tongue twister. What that lived life is like. We cannot know the lived life of the student directly. So we have to approach it. We have to ask them to convey it to us, and in the form of a story. That's on the listening side. When we are imparting advice to students, telling stories is one of the main modalities that advisors have available for the use in order to advise. We use examples, for example. We use examples from real lives. We use examples from our own life. How often have you shared your own shortcomings as a first-year student with some despondent student who has just failed pre-calculus like you did in your first semester? In my case, it was biology. I failed biology, mea culpa, in my first semester in college. But we share real-world examples of other students as well. We'll say to the student before us, well, I had a student last week who also failed pre-calculus, and this is what happened to him or her. But more importantly, we tell stories that are hypothetical in nature. We flesh out the consequences of the choices being contemplated, such as when a change of major is being contemplated. So we tell the story of how events are likely to unfold, such as when that very same student who failed pre-calculus comes to our office and says, I don't care, I'm ready to plunge into calculus, off I go. We flesh out the consequences, what is likely to happen. Not certainly what is going to happen, but what is likely to happen if the student continues with that storyline. So this is fiction. We engage in acts of fiction, my friends, my fellow advisors across our several nations. We engage in fiction together with our students. We tell stories, we listen to stories. We are narratologists of the first order. Advisors are biographers of students' futures, at least in a sense. So, another major claim. I know we're asking you to swallow a lot, but here goes. Fools rush in, and so here I go. We help students write this very, very important chapter in their biographies, the story of their education. In the field of literature, stories of education or acculturation are called Bildungsromane. It's an English word, but it's obviously adopted from German. Roman means novel or story, and Bildung, I'm not sure if I have this exactly in German, but it has to do with acculturation or education, related to our word building, yes indeed, but not exactly co-equal with it. Novels or stories of acculturation or education. There's a couple of quick examples on the screen. James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a Bildungsroman. It is the story of an education, and it ends when, I think, when he feels that his education is complete. Jane Austen's Emma, as is the case with many of her novels, is a story of acculturation or of education. Emma finally learns how to be an adult in the world. It's a Bildungsroman, a story of education. These are powerful forms of narrative. Stories of education are really exciting, especially to us who are advisors. And I would submit to you that you do find them exciting and fun to listen to. Yeah. So another student comes in, well, I'm thinking of changing over to physical therapy. And you think to yourself, how often have I heard that story? But the thing is, they are still exciting stories. And in evidence of that, I would submit to you that you are still in higher education, so you must find stories of education engaging. So then the last of the 5 major claims that we wish to make is that what we already know about narrative can foster better advising, can foster good advising. So if academic is so very much tied up with storylines, with narrative, then what we already know about narrative can foster good advising. So what do we already know about narrative? Well, we're going to cover 5, I think there are 5 master elements that are present in all narratives, both narratives in literature and in advising interactions. So both fictional narratives and the ones that are actually lived. So first of the master elements of any narrative is context. This is the frame or the place in which the other elements of the narrative house themselves. It's where it takes place. If you're at home reading a book, it's the reading situation. If you're in your office talking to a student, it's the speaking situation, which could be a discourse that takes place in via email or Twitter. In any narrative, there are more than 2 persons that are in that narrative space. Let's focus on the author. We know from literature that we do not know the full totality of the person who was Charles Dickens, for example. But we know a little bit about who he was writing for, how he saw himself, and we can get that from contemporary biographies, yes, but also from what he himself wrote. So in any narrative situation, there is a real author, the real flesh and blood author. In the situation that you and I are in today, there's the real me. I like to think that I'm a real person, flesh and blood. I like to think that blood courses through my veins, but you don't know me very well. All you can do is make inferences based on what you see, the wild gestures that I'm making, the books behind me. I rented them for the occasion. How do they look? So you're making judgments about who I am. You are making up a character, a personage that is the implied author in the situation that we are in right now. I'm doing the same thing to you. I can't see you. I see a list of your names over on the left-hand side of my monitor, but I don't know really who you are. I have your names. Hi, Avi. I know some of you. Hi, Casey. It's good to have you here. But by and large, I don't know you all as a group, and so I make you up. I create a personage or a set of personages that we could call the implied audience. There's the real you sitting and probably bored to tears about now, hoping for a second cup of coffee if you're out there in Los Angeles or Hawaii. And yet there's the implied audience that we create. Well, this is true in any student situation, advising situation. Here I am, I'm the real advisor, my students sit over there in the chair, and I'm making up a version of them. That's the person that I'm speaking to because I cannot know the entire extent of what it is like to be that student. So I make up an implied audience. That's the person for whom I tailor my remarks, hoping that I will reach the real student, the real audience. Now, when roles reverse and all of a sudden the student is speaking, now there are 4 new personages right here in my office. There's the real student who's the author at this point, the implied author, the person that I make up, the real audience, that's me or you, and then the implied audience, that's the person that the student sees herself or himself speaking to. It gets complicated when there are 8 personages in the room at the same time. Well, why is this important? I mean, who cares about implied audiences and real audiences and so on? Why is this so important for advising? And I think that it's important because it keeps us humble and honest. Yes, real physical events do occur. My words have a physicality to them. They go through the air and they land with a splash in my students' semicircular canal, but as they make their difficult way up to their mind, things happen, and all of a sudden the reality of the words becomes different. They become symbols, which is what they were all the way along. And all symbols are merely symbols, and they're all open to interpretation. So real versus implied recognizes this gap between and highlights the need to consistently strive to make our interpretations as close to reality as we can, so that we can approach the student as an individual. They deserve that much. Whew. On to style. Richard, tag.
Okay, so we have the abstract, symbolic, metaphorical concept in terms of context. How do we get this story told? So a way to approach this is by approaching the situation, the student, his or her narrative, as a story. And going back to our early days in middle school or high school literature classes, we deal with the literary elements of a story. One of the ways a story is told, and the how is very important because it emphasizes this as a process, that this is not just a finite concept or experience. So one thing is the point of view. Who is really telling the story of the student's education? And when you have that dynamic between just 2 people in an office, there is a lot going on in terms of point of view, beyond just first person, second person, third person. Characterization is a second aspect of how a story is told. The slide gives an example. How does a student portray his or her identity? As a valiant warrior or a victim of circumstance? And the minute we as advisors hear that characterization, we start cataloging approaches. How do we deal with this? This is how we address this. Perhaps we should look at it this way, and go on to our own stories. So exponentially, the context is constantly growing. Symbols and imagery are very important also. What metaphors are the students using to relate their experiences? And this is very important because one student, through cultural background, through ethnic background, through personal struggles, may see something symbolic without even realizing that it's symbolic, whereas somebody else would see something totally different. And then you pointed out the books that you rented for the presentation there, but that they become symbols. So when the student comes in, they already have a concept of that symbol and a story. The diction, language, and language usage by a student is also very important. Good storytelling depends on the diction and the language. How a student presents him or herself tells the story of that student, and likewise the advisor. And then through that diction and language usage, is the student a trustworthy narrator?
So these things show up in literature as well. There are novels where the narrator is not trustworthy. Wuthering Heights is a good example of that. I wanted to just jump in there, Richard, and say, oh, come on, metaphor? Are you kidding me? Metaphors are just things we come across in poetry. How can you assert that metaphors show up in an advising interaction? What?
No. And then you quote something from the Fantastics, more than a metaphor will ever be.
But they do. You know, friends, if students come into your office and say, well, I really kicked that exam, that's a metaphor. And the metaphor that they choose to live by says something about how they see this narrative unfolding. Well, we have our first lady up on the screen, so we will move on and talk about theme.
I'll take this.
All right.
All right. So all of these elements of any type of story, characterization, point of view, for the most part, they are instruments or tools to get to a larger meaning, and that's what theme is. So on a concrete level, we have these elements and a plot, which we'll get into much more in detail after this slide. But on another level, these things combine to make a sense of meaning. So the theme becomes the meaning of the narrative for the author and the audience. This is only available to us through the art or science of interpretation. I know a pet subject of yours, something that I marvel in all the time, the concept of hermeneutics.
Yeah, that's how we can get to the theme, is through interpretation. It requires you to be humble. It requires you to, to not obtrude your personality into the narrative. I've called this elsewhere epistemic humility. So I see Avi's trying to keep me on a logical plane here. No metaphor is true. I don't know, Avi. Read Romeo and Juliet again. He's right, though, in a literal sense. Metaphors are not exactly true. But I would submit to you, Avi, it is one of the main ways we have of getting at the truth of a thing.
Well, I'd like to address this also. The only difference between a metaphor and a simile, beside the use of like or as, is the concept that it becomes it's more easily and more immediately established, a simile, and may not have the import that a metaphor that can be extended over a period of time in a story, pages or paragraphs, or any work in a film, a series of images. But the idea is that language itself then becomes a metaphor. So that I have to bring up the authenticity thing, even though I know we were going to do it toward the end. But think about that in terms of the poster of the question, the concept of how metaphor, regardless of true or not, lends to the paradoxical aspect of authenticity. But we'll speak more to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, we don't want to get too pedantic here.
Yeah.
What we're trying to say overall is that the metaphors that a student chooses to use will often say something about their state of mind. Well, so much for theme. Shall we move on? Do we want to say anything more about theme?
No, because the plot's pretty heavy.
Yeah, the plot thickens, my friends.
Yes.
We, the two of us, have been heavily influenced by a rather ponderous tome called The 7 Basic Plots, Why We Tell Stories, by Christopher Booker from 2004. It took him 34 years to write the book, and friends, it shows because it's about 700 pages. He didn't know when to stop. It is obviously reductionist to have 7 types of plot. Well, that's somewhat reductionist. It's not quite as reductionist as Joseph Campbell, you know, the monomyth. There's just one plot. So we're going with 7, at least for the time being, for our purposes here today. So it works pretty well to think of 7 basic types of plot when it comes to advising interactions. So, Richard,
I'll take off with the first one. And just for the audience out there, note that on the slide, there are only 1 or 2 examples of each. You have the supplement that goes along with the webinar that has a list of more examples and even a second level of examples, but we'll get more into that toward the end of this. So the first basic plot that Booker talks about is the concept of overcoming a monster. In this case, Beowulf is a prime example of a piece of literature or a narrative that is consummate at depicting overcoming a monster. On a literal level, Beowulf has to overcome Grendel, and then later Grendel's mother, even more monsterish than Grendel him or itself. But how this can apply to advising, that monster may not be Grendel literally, but that's the metaphor for, let's say, a student who has dropped organic chemistry twice and is failing it currently, knows he or she needs to do it the 3rd time around, or else they could be kicked out of their major, so to speak. That failing does not seem to the student nor to the advisor an option, if you will. So the story has to have some sense of plot to have the student overcome that monster, pass organic chemistry. And this kind of plot is based on overcoming an inability.
Yeah, and then once you've got Grendel taken care of, out comes his mother.
So you go, right. On beyond organic chemistry.
So the next 2 plot types are fairly straightforward, and you have some examples on the screen. Rags to riches is where the central crisis of some kind moves the student from to maturity, from being immature to being mature, just like in Aladdin or Cinderella. The quest, very similar. Oftentimes it's the protagonist embarks with a group of friends, and for the first time we start seeing an advisor. A good example is Odysseus in the Odyssey. His advisor is one of the best that anybody could have ever had, Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And so there are many such stories, and we see them in advising as well. Richard, would you want to take the next one?
The quest?
Voyage and Return.
Oh, Voyage and Return, okay.
I was kind of lumping together.
Oh, lumping together, okay. So Voyage and Return basically is where the protagonist lands in a realm where the normal laws do not apply. And our example, one of which we're using in a class this semester, is the film Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, where the protagonist, in this case, the set of protagonists, voyage out beyond their comfort zone. And in the process of voyaging out beyond the comfort zone, learn skills that allow them to come back to their point of departure and deal with things that seemed insurmountable to begin with. So in terms of advising, your advisee is juggling a full-time credit load with a full-time job. I'm sorry, excuse me, that was the comedy one. Had to leave, so the student had to leave school for health or financial reasons. The voyaging out beyond what they are used to, school, and then comes back to college now with that life experience and a different value for the education that he or she is committing to. Allowing that student to become a better learner and to encounter the demands that perhaps were not as easily dealt with prior to leaving or voyaging out.
So the next 2 we can kind of lump together as well, comedy and tragedy. We all understand, for the most part, what they are. You started to read from the handout.
Yeah.
And let's do that. Your advisee is juggling full-time credit load with a full-time job. She comes to you to approve a course overload so that they can complete the 3rd minor and the 2nd major and still graduate this semester. but to do so, piece of cake, just have to take 28 credits this semester instead of only 20. So that's a potential tragedy, obviously, and our role as advisors is often to turn tragedies into comedies. Well, a definition of comedy might be something along the lines of the protagonist has there's a lot of misunderstandings happening, dark forces are at work, but finally the protagonist is redeemed either by herself or himself or external forces. There's a marriage, there's great rejoicing, and order is restored to the land. But in tragedy, such as, well, any of the Shakespearean tragedies, Hamlet, King Lear, or further back in time, Oedipus Rex, the protagonist is overcome by their own blindness. They have tragic flaws. They can't see things for what they really are. Of course, in the case of Oedipus the king, he really can't see. Or was that Tiresias? At any rate, one of them can't see.
Tiresias can't see.
Okay.
Literally, and King Lear can't see metaphorically.
Okay. But I think he blinds himself later, doesn't he?
No,
who am I thinking?
He doesn't blind, no. Ed, what's his friend?
Anyway.
Is blinded by one of the brother-in-laws, son-in-laws.
Here we go, being pedantic again. Anyway, in tragedy, the protagonist is destroyed by their own shortcomings, by their own blindnesses. So,
the last one is Rebirth. The classic example of Rebirth that I think most people can relate to because of the just being saturated in the Western psyche, especially, is A Christmas Carol and Ebenezer Scrooge, where Rebirth deals with the protagonist that is not only redeemed, but is transformed. You're not just able to deal with certain things, but brings the psyche of the person, the very being of the person, to a whole other level that did not exist prior, nor did that character even think of ever existing on another level. Silas Marner is another example in literature, very miserly in the beginning, and it isn't until he is redeemed and totally transformed through the adoption of Epi and just marvels at the idea of being a parent, if you will, or a guardian. In terms of advising, this is and a great example, especially for our school, is the veteran situation and experience. So your student is a returning veteran who suffers from PTSD and has no prior college experience. Coming into college afterwards, he or she is gradually but totally transformed, not only through the college experience of taking classes, but what the import of those classes do to the person. And idealistically, through his reinvention or through her reinvention, possibly even sees the diminishing returns of the PTSD.
So here's what I'd like to do. Instead of you asking us a question, I'd like to ask you all a question right now. I know you didn't study for this test, but here it is, pop quiz. I want you to think about Harry Potter, and I want you to think about Game of Thrones. Let's keep it simple and just say Volume 1 of Harry Potter and Episode 1 of Game of Thrones. Those being two recent narratives that are very much in our collective consciousness. Here's the question. Which of the 7 plot lines seems to summarize that best? I know in Game of Thrones it's complicated, so is Harry Potter. But more importantly, do you see either of those two works as being able to shed any light on advising? So we'll remain absolutely silent for the next 10 to 20 minutes. No. We're gonna move on. So if you think of something, let us know through the question and answer things. I see Ruth Darling is logged on. Hi, Ruth. Ruth and I talked about these kinds of issues many, many years ago. Glad to have you aboard. So if all of these claims that we've been making have any truth to them, then students and advisors' narrative skills should be fostered and developed. And I mean, I think we're here to claim that first, we already have lots of narrative skills. If Gottschall is at all on board, on target, we are the storytelling animals after all. It's in our DNA. We have the skills to begin with, but Richard and I are asserting that we need to teach ourselves more, to develop our our skill as narrators and as listeners to stories. Let me tell you a short story. The other day, I was sitting with a student and her mother. Why am I pointing over there? Because she sat right there. And she was having difficulty. I think she was thinking about not returning to school. Maybe she was encountering the monster of Grendel or Grendel's mother. I forget what the exact issue was. But her phone started ringing. It was the tone for a text message coming in. And that's happened enough times in my office, so you begin to recognize these. And I knew it was from the Hunger Games. The tone, the ringtone was from the Hunger Games. She didn't answer the text. Then a couple moments later, it went off again from the Hunger Games. And so towards the end of the conversation, I finally looked her in the eye and said, "What would Katniss Everdeen do?" Now, maybe that's a trivial thing to say in an advising situation, but it really hit home to her. What I inferred about my implied audience was that the Hunger Games was really important to her. And maybe it served to structure her life. I didn't know for sure. But when you ask the question, what would Katniss Everdeen do? We should have shirts made, WWKD. It really hit home. And so through narrative, or some knowledge of narrative, I was able to reach that particular student. Okay, that's maybe an out-of-the-way story. So we are asserting that we advisors need to hone our administrative, good heavens, get my mind out of the gutter. We need to hone our narrative skills. So how do we do that? First of all, I think that our role as listeners we can enhance by encountering difficult and still more difficult narratives, and maybe discussing such narratives in reading groups of advisors. I think somewhere on our list in the handout is Ulysses by James Joyce, a very difficult novel, but primarily about narrative itself, and so possibly very fruitful to engage in as a reading group or a common reading at your advising center, at your campus. A similarly difficult book that is about narrative, about storytelling itself, would be Cloud Atlas, a far more recent novel, and a terrific movie as well. I think that we advisors could have a common reading of A Doll's House by Henry Gibson, which is usually thought of as the emancipation of woman, but it's really about self-authorship after all. It's about emancipation of a person, someone who becomes a fully enfranchised human being. But even just case studies, getting together and talking about, oh, I had this student who, ... that's just the advisor's way of saying, once upon a time, and they launch into a story. I had a student who, and you know that there's a story right around the corner. If we look upon ourselves as storytellers, I think we need to dig deep into our treasure trove of stories of our own Bildungsroman, our own story of our education. What was our plot, our theme? How did we regard our education?
And not only that, if I may interrupt, but our own stories are very important in terms of advising, but what has become talismanic volumes, pieces of work, literature, music, movies, that you can share with the student, so that you may not want to say something that's very personal, but you can refer to another work saying this means something, or this meant something, or this spoke to me, and then see how the reaction goes and where this takes you in terms of the dynamic between you and the student.
So when you see the next slide, you might be thinking, oh, come on. We're expected to teach students narrative skills? Please, I've only got 15 minutes. What am I supposed to do? Teach them how to be a narrator? I don't think so. But indeed, this is what we are saying. We do say that not only advisors should hone their narrative skills, but we should do what we can to teach students narrative skills as well. We teach them by example. I mean, if you have a shelf of books behind you, it says one thing about you. It says, hey, you're either an educated person or you want to be. And we're among the few people who listen to them about their life stories, and so it behooves us to do so. So we need to demonstrate our interest as a listener and ask questions that focus on the narrative that's ongoing. With respect to style, we can say, can you say that in a different way? With respect to theme, we could say, So what did that mean for you? These are simplistic questions, of course, but they focus on the narrative itself. Plot, good old plot. Oh, so then what happened? These are questions we can use to demonstrate our keen interest as a listener, which will help the student be a better storyteller. It kind of can't help but be so. Recapitulating what you've heard so far. So you're telling me that, and this is what I understand the story to be. So yes, we think that the ways in which we conduct the interview can have a bearing on teaching our students better narrative skills. But we go further than that. Richard?
Wait, I tend to be a slave driver to my advisees. And while I know that this cannot be done with everyone that walks through our office, there are some of the repeat offenders, I say lovingly, and or the adoptees. So I assign readings and or writing assignments to them. And what I try to do is, excuse me, key into something that is important to them. And the one student that I like giving as an example is his love of music, and rap music is just the one thing that you cannot get away from when you speak maybe 5 minutes with this guy. And so what I do, especially after the first time he came into my office, I have other walls that have quotes from pieces of literature from people saying things. He was determined to have one of his bars, because he likes writing the lyrics to rap music, on the wall. And so what I did when he said something about it, like, what's it take to get up on the wall, is, try it. And what he does now, several times a week, is just either text or stop in and give me lines, his bars, all the while not letting me, the public know that it's going to ruin his street credibility if he does something like this. But the idea is that the engaging comes in where he insists on explaining some aspect of his life in 2 or 3 lines of words that have a cadence that are musical unto themselves. Whether we appreciate individually that music or not is beside the point. Other students may come in with not maybe music, but with a story, or I'll give them something. Here, watch this. Let me know what you think. And how they let me know what they think is more along the lines of they're coming back with, well, you watch this and let me know what you think. And that's a real thing with one student. And I just watched a short animated film called It's a Beautiful Day, because a student said, well, you had me look at this, this, and this. Now you watch this.
Mm-hmm. What you can't see behind Richard, on the wall that you can't see, he's got quotations from all over the field of literature and student quotations. Now, I want to call your attention to the question and answer. I'm assuming that you can all see the questions that are being asked. Rachel Moody has written in to say, in the Advisement Services Center at U Albany, we encourage students to tell their stories outside of the advisement session via blogging and videos. Rachel, I was all set to give you a shout out just at this moment anyway. I'm glad you wrote in. I've placed the URL for that blog in the handout. So friends all across the several nations and around the world, click on that link and check out the blog that Rachel Moody and others have created at the University of Albany. It's really splendid. And yes, it helps to train students to be a better narrator. Sometimes students have a difficult time telling their story. Sometimes they can only do it obliquely. We have to work at getting them to be in a safe place where they can tell their stories. By teaching them narrative skill, we bring them that much closer to self-authorship, which the phrase self-authorship, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with that already. But that's all about narrative, being able to live the story well, but also tell the story, to move to a point where you are making your own decisions for yourself, but also being able to articulate those. That, I think, is all part of self-authorship. That moves students towards authenticity, which I think is the very highest thing that we can do. So, friends, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we'd like to devote that time to the questions that you have.
Well, the first question, what advice do you have for an advisor who hasn't heard of a book, a rap group, or another example that a student might mention? And herein is something that ties into how could this concept of advising, which is a whole way of looking at advising, not necessarily just a mirror, or not even a mirror, but a screen to look at, an approach to advising only, is how does something like this apply to business or to engineering or to nursing or health science fields? And in this situation, in terms of wanting one's worth as an advisor and an ongoingness in strengthening the field of advising, it behooves advisors to experience those narratives that speak to those subjects. So for engineering students, the wealth of stories that are out there, films, books, Alexander's Bridge, Willa Cather's first novel about an architect, where the bridge becomes, or the building of the bridge, a metaphor for this individual's life. The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, regardless of whether one agrees with the politics or not, the idea of the central character being an architect and how he defines himself through the course of getting social things done as opposed to personal things. For health science, the whole field that is opening up with short stories, memoirs of women who have been involved in the war effort, who have up to this point maybe have been marginal, but have kept documents of their work. The Backwash of War by Ellen Lamott, for example, or the Forbidden Zone by Mary Borden. And then for business, anything by Sinclair Lewis, Babbitt, Dodsworth. But the idea is, and it's not whole things, just pieces of things at first.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that you do have to engage in talking about narratives, especially if you only got 15-minute appointments. What we're trying to say here is that narrative is not necessarily what we talk about in our advising interactions. It is how we talk. So just this morning, Richard and I were struggling with how to think about this. It's not really an approach, even though I recognize that's in our title. And it's not really a philosophy advising. It's kind of, let's test this phrase out. It's a pragmatics of advising. It's about the praxis of advising, the praxis of advising. It's how we do it. And so even if you are sitting in a advising center where you've only got 15 minutes and all you're doing is making a schedule for the student, still, it's a narrative. It's a narrative situation. And you have to recognize that. We've got some good questions coming up. Do you want to take the encouraging advisors not to focus on bringing their own judgments, or because I have an answer for that one? Yes, so I'd urge you to take it because I don't. Okay, so it's very hard sometimes to have a student come in and somebody will say, well, I listened to this, or here's something that speaks to me. And that's exactly what I do when I think, well, all right, this is a good level to begin with, but we want to try to get the student to another level, rather than have that appalled look. Although I do clutch my chest sometimes when it's a student that I'm familiar with and they appreciate the histrionics. Ask the student to what does this work do for you? How does it speak? And go to the how. And after a while, it's no longer about the work, it's about the student, how he or she conceives of him or herself, and how to approach certain things. So in that respect, it's not necessarily, I don't like this, that's not good enough for me as an advisor to have you comparing yourself to something that other people may think is mundane or trite or redundant. But it does help to get the student to vocalize what it is that means something to that student, how he or she authors him or herself. Avi Rosenzweig has written in to say, it's not a question, it's a statement. And he says, STEM researchers know that a blunt instrument can't take a detailed measurement. We need to refine and complicate our narratives, not simplify them. And to that, I think I can speak for the team, for both of us, and say, That's right, brother. We're all about complicating narratives, not making them difficult, but encountering difficult narratives ourselves as advisors to make us that much more skilled, gradually, incrementally over time, at being able to encounter more and more refined narratives from our students and to convey to them more and more refined narratives. We provided a list of what we call Narratives 2.0 on the handout, not for the faint of heart. These are mainly books, but a couple of operas too, that we feel are difficult, not just very simple narratives. They can really help you in your work. I like this next question. I'm told you cannot see the question, so we're going to read them out. I'm going to read the question. Richard, you want to take a shot at it? But the question says, how do we work in narrative when our institution is focused on data and analytics? Well, no. I was going to say get a new job, but that's not right.
Okay, since we were discussing this earlier, it's something that's a reality. Any institution, by definition of institution, is not going to be able to shirk this or ignore it. But in terms of advising, when that student is in front of the advisor, that data, that fact and figure, kind of takes back seat to the narrative, to the student's authorship, self-authoring or co-authoring in terms of our help. And this is not hours, this is just minutes. And over a period of time, we build our own skills, complicate, if you will, challenging ourselves. It becomes second nature to us. It's like Picasso. Yeah, he may have thought about how to do a painting in the beginning of his career, but by all reports, he could do what people are paying millions of dollars for in less than 30 minutes because it becomes so much a part of him. It is an extension of the self. The facts and figures that the higher ups in an institution worry about, the numbers crunchers, it will follow through because you have a student who is successful in becoming a citizen, not just a job.
Yeah, we recognize that a narratological approach to the pragmatics of advising is messy. We're not advocating a method here. This is not a method that can be quantified. Look, a lot of provosts and deans and vice presidents like that, the fact that you can quantify things. It makes it easy to make judgments. We are not advocating a method where if you do this, this, and this, then you have 20% higher retention in the next semester. It just doesn't happen that way. It's very messy. To the person, that person was anonymous who spoke that question, I don't know what to suggest except, keep the faith. Keep the faith. If narratives are important to you, make sure others around you know it.
You want to take the next one?
I'll read it.
Okay.
You'll jump right on in there, but we did talk earlier about Wuthering Heights and an untrustworthy narrator. The question reads, what do you recommend when working with a student who is an untrustworthy narrator?
Well, I would approach this two ways, both of which may sound as if it's entrapping the student, almost like, ha, I got you, but that is not what's really happening. One is expose yourself to works, not just stories. It could be any form of narrative style of or by an untrustworthy narrator, because what this does is it hones your skills as to what to hear, what to sense, what's really going on with the student on the opposite side of the desk, and even ourselves. To balance that, we have the assignments. Throw out something that does deal with an untrustworthy narrator to the student in some way, shape, or form, and have that task met. Say, here, look at this, read this, think about this. If you use words like think about, it's not that the student's going to do it right at that moment, but the thinking about does plant the seed. It does get in or under the skin, so to speak. And the ability to expose a student to what is an untrustworthy narrator can possibly help shape that student into what not to do, or how to be more self-authenticating, if you will, as opposed to denying.
We have a very interesting question here from Stephen Ankney, who starts by applauding us, Richard. He says, thanks for presenting. Woohoo!
No problem.
He goes on to ask, is there a concern that utilizing this narrative approach can create villains and heroes that are just or unjust? For example, he says, in the case you mentioned regarding a student trying to pass organic chemistry, my concern is subconsciously creating a villain out of the instructor. Oh, good heavens, we encounter that all the time. Richard and I were just talking about a case like that moments before we went on air. But yeah, we don't mean to construe the professor as villain, though students like to do that. It is organic chemistry itself. You know, the super monster with a helmet and a cape and everything, Orgo, the awful, organic chemistry. That's the villain in students' minds sometimes that has to be conquered. But yeah, there's a risk, I suppose, of casting the professor into the role of villain. We certainly don't want to do that.
And to, you know, here's another, you know, quote from literature, and you can throw this out as an advisor. I am that power which wills forever evil, but does forever good. We see, you know, just phrase, the professor's not the one here. There's not the villain, although it may appear to be the villain. There's always that plot twist at the end. You thought this was bad, but really it isn't.
We have possibly the most difficult question of all from Rita Henry. Thank you, Rita. But she asks, what works of fiction would you consider must-reads for advisors? Any suggested books or films? You know, this is a tough question. And the problem with any reading list is you're going to leave stuff off of it that somebody else would say, well, this was vital to my career as an advisor. We have attempted that in the handout. So any of the works that are present in the handout, we would recommend. We've one or the other of us have been through all of them. Some we both read. He keeps assigning me that guy. He keeps assigning me. So because of Richard's involvement in literature, I've read Atonement, Wolf Hall. Middlesex is a great book. But I'm going to recommend one additional one that is not on this list, and I would recommend The Phaedrus of Plato, because it is about the very first advising interaction, the very first recorded advising interaction, and it concerns the very first recorded change of major. So the Phaedrus, Phaedrus, the Phaedrus. It's a work of philosophy, yes, but it's about the primary questions that it examines are, what shall we study and how shall we study it? So I would recommend that. In addition to what's on our handout. Richard, you might have others you want to add.
I do. I would like to add, which is not on this list, Cloud Atlas. But there are some other ones that I would like to add to the list, and that addresses Avi Rosenzweig's question. So I'll wait to address that one specifically in terms of going beyond the borders of what would normally be a Western literature, if you will, or dead white men literature. But here's something else. The concept of which specific examples would be so great and would take up so much of our time that that you can just email us and we'll be happy to supplement anything.
And speaking of time, we are out of that critter. It's all gone. We're at the top of the hour again. I see Lee is joining us. We have some other questions that we'll try to answer by in some other way. Please email us. You have our emails in the handout. We would be delighted to hear from you and to field your questions. But time is the one thing we have no more of. Lee, did you want to say some concluding words?
Yes, thank you. I want to thank you both. We can stay for a couple of minutes after the top of the hour if we want, but we know that people often have to vacate the rooms that they're in and leave, so we do need to make sure that we do a wrap up at this point in time. And I wanted to take just a couple of minutes and give our viewers a little piece of information that will make them the first to hear this. I'm really excited to be able to tell you. You may be aware that a new initiative that was spearheaded by our Associate Director for Content, Jennifer Jocelyn, this past year, is the NACADA Reads that is being done online. We've been doing common readings at conferences for many years now, but this is a new initiative that's been done online this past year. We've had two very successful incidents of it so far. There's one in the works, and I'm just delighted to say that Peter and Richard have agreed to be our fourth in this series. And we're looking, we don't have the date set yet. It probably early August is what we're kind of looking at. I will send out a URL in the follow-up email that will give you the web page where you can go, and the information will become available when it is available. But I just wanted to put that information out and let you all be the first to hear that. When I was in the advising chair, the question I always asked was, okay, how do I make this work? Show me how to do this. And so we've talked a lot of here's how, but we're actually going to work through an opportunity experience here's how. So thank you all for agreeing to that, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I thank you all so much for being with us today. So I know that many of you will have to leave at this point, but Peter and Richard, if you don't mind staying for another minute or two to answer those questions for those who can stay,
Sure.
we'll be glad to do that. Thanks.
Not at all. Can we address, Avi, if you're still in your room, and just for the sake of time, by all means, email me, and I'll be glad to give you lists of things beyond just what we gave you, especially in terms of personal things that I like, Indian literature, Japanese literature, Australian literature, French literature, Scandinavian literature. So if you're still there, by all means, email.
Another person, right? I'm not sure of your name. A.G. Flores says, "Thanks for presenting." Woohoo! Thank you. It is narrative therapy in the advising world! Exclamation point. Yeah, I suppose so. Narrative therapy has some traction in the world of counseling, certainly. So I'm not so sure we're regarding it as therapy so much as the very means and basis upon which advising and, well, counseling for that matter, can take place. The telling and the hearing of stories.
And here's the question. It's, can you provide additional examples of questions that can be asked to focus on the student's narratives? Further examples, my personal ones are to put to task the student, give them things to do, expect a follow-up, if you will, even if it's for seconds. Students are constantly coming into our office just to drop off something, just to say, oh, by the way. And when you address that need, there is a continuum. It just picks up pace, I have found anyway.
Another thing you can do is ask students the same kinds of questions that you would ask of a book that you're reading. I don't know if you're accustomed to reading with a pencil, but I am, and as I read a novel or any text, I write in the margin. I'll ask questions. What do they mean by this? What's going on here? So those kinds of feedback questions, clarification questions, can really keep a student on task. Another thing that I do is I actually assign readings to students. I will assign them a poem. I'll make a copy from my shelf back there and give it to them, and I say, read this, let's talk about it next time we get together. And so these can help focus their attention on the active narrative. I love On First Looking into Chapman's Homer by John Keats. It's kind of conveys the joy of learning itself. Wordsworth's The World is Too Much With Us, Late and Soon, I think should be mandatory for every prospective business major to read. Frost, The Road Less Traveled, what a great poem to encounter when you're at the point of a decision. So there are other ways that you can focus on the process of narrative. Christopher Osgood writes to say, my perception of a villain, a state of existence within the student that was preventing them from doing well, despite having the ability, as stated. For example, the villain could be anxiety. So you're spot on there. Christopher, I'm not sure if you're still with us. Doesn't look like you are, but anyway, good comment.
Thank you both so much for staying to answer those last questions. Gary, I think we're done now.